Our final speaker before the break is Daniel Beckman, who is currently postdoctoral research associate at the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar Rahmani Center for Iran-Persians Gulf Studies at Princeton University. He returns to UCLA after completing his dissertation here in Iranian studies 3 years ago. That dissertation was on the use of treaties in the Achaemenid Empire. He is also published on Cyrus the Great and Ancient Propaganda, Artaxerxes' Aegean Policy, and the many deaths of Cyrus the Great. And among his particular interests are the moments and places of cultural intersection in the ancient world. His talk this afternoon is Into the Ashes, the Punishment at the Achaemenid Court. Please welcome Daniel back to the podium.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thank you, of course, to Rahim, the entire Melamu board, and to Marissa and to everyone on the staff who's helping make this event run so smoothly. My talk today is an extension of a small project that I'm working on, which looks at law and justice, punishment and reconciliation, specifically among the imperial elites of the Achaemenid Empire. My basic premise, in short, is that while the great king claims to enforce his law, his data, on the entire empire, and that's basically, all there is to it, in reality, people like satraps and other high officials have to be treated quite differently. The king, no matter how great he may claim to be, he cannot simply arrest or punish or eliminate these high-ranking officials at will, because these officials have sufficient resources to resist, even if it's ultimately unsuccessful. So today I want to just look at one narrative of punishment at the Achaemenid court and see what it can tell us. So, in his Persika, written in the early 4th century BCE, the physician and writer Ctesias of Knidos writes about a number of elite Persians who are sent to their deaths or eliminated quite violently as a result of court intrigues or plots or rebellions. And 5 of these victims on 4 separate occasions are thrown into the ashes, spodὸν ἐμβάλλειν. And this is what I'm calling the punishment of the ashes. Now, as is usually the case with Ctesias, for those of you who are familiar with his work, and with Achaemenid history more generally, we don't have the resources necessary to state with any sort of confidence whether or not these particular narratives are based at all in historical fact, and we can't say where Ctesias got his information, what he's basing this narrative on. Ctesias is only preserved in epitomes and references written by other writers. The ones that are on your handout here on the first page come from the 9th century CE Bibliotheca of the Byzantine Patriarch Photius. This is well over 1,000 years after Ctesias wrote his original work. This means that everything I have to say is very speculative. I'm going to admit that up front, and I'm going to repeat it at the end. And so rather than trying to determine whether or not these narratives are quote-unquote true or false, I want to focus more on what we can learn about the ideology of punishment at the Achaemenid court, as well as narratives of punishment in Greek historiography. So looking at the evidence from Ctesias, once again, there are 5 elite Persians who are thrown into the ashes in 4 separate occasions because in one incident there are 2 rebels who suffer the same punishment more or less simultaneously. And to save time, I'm not going to read them all, and frankly, they're fairly repetitive. And so actually I want to focus on this patterns that we can see there. In general, what happens is a rebel or someone who is a threat to the king is tricked. He's offered mercy, or the king just wants to have a conversation with him, at which point he is arrested and then thrown into the ashes. And that's really all we have about this punishment. And again, whether or not this is because Photius has decided to leave that out or because Ctesias was very brief in the original, no idea. Now, other similarities are that the victims are all named individuals, and they are of the highest levels of the imperial elite, including from the royal family. And actually, the first victim is a king. This is Secundianus or Sogdianus, who's the first victim. There's also a very limited chronological span for this punishment. The first 4 cases occur in the early years of the reign of Darius II, from about 424, going on for about 5 or 10 years. And then the final case occurs again during the early years of Artaxerxes II, in about 401, during the rebellion of Cyrus the Younger. Now, of course, in the narratives, we can also see similarities that are typical of Ctesias' writing. We have, the tropes of the violence of the imperial women. We have the scheming eunuchs, and so on and so forth. These narratives are very much problematic because of these. Now, one thing that struck me as interesting as I started to investigate these passages is that I've been unable to find similar accounts elsewhere in classical literature, and actually from the broader Near Eastern world prior to Ctesias' own writings. Now, I certainly might have left something out. Really, the only thing that I could find was from the book of Jeremiah, who says that Nebuchadnezzar roasts alive 2 prophets. I'm certainly not a biblical scholar, so I don't really have any commentary on that. And of course, we know that the Assyrian kings burn structures with fire, but I'm not aware of them ever talking about using burning someone alive as a punishment. But please do correct me if I've left something out. Now, after Ctesias, there are a few accounts of something very similar to what we find in Ctesias. Going in chronological order, first we have the book of 2nd Maccabees, which is supposedly an epitome of a lost work by one Jason of Cyrene. In this particular section, chapter 13, the Seleucid king Antiochus V has decided to eliminate the scheming and wicked high priest Menelaus. And this is happening in about 164 BCE. Now, of course, there's this whole broader context of what's going on in Judea, which we're not going to get into. But Antiochus decides to send Menelaus to Borea, which is modern Aleppo, more or less, and he's executed there in what we are told is a customary local method. Basically, according to the text, there's this really tall tower with a depression that's filled with ashes, and this is a punishment reserved for people guilty of sacrilege or very serious crimes. They are thrown into these ashes, and they die in such a way that they are deprived of burial. And in a specifically Jewish context, this is an extra level of punishment, the fact that the person can't be buried. Now, the description of this punishment as a local tradition in Syria is, I think, a little bit confusing. As I say, because I haven't really been able to find such a punishment in any other, any mentions of this, I'm curious as to whether or not the author is sort of confusing an Achaemenid practice, or what he believes to be an Achaemenid practice that happens to occur in Syria, or because the Achaemenids are the prior kings of Syria, as opposed to some a quote unquote native Syrian practice prior to Achaemenid rule or something like that. I don't really have an explanation for that. Now, when I hear tall tower filled with ashes, possibly influenced by historiography about the Persians, I think fire temple, right? But this is also problematic. I think Ali Mousavi's presentation earlier sort of shows the state of the evidence for the use of fire in the Achaemenid period. It certainly was a part of religious practice at the time, but these very large monumental structures as fire temples, there doesn't seem to be any evidence for this in the early Achaemenid period, at least in the time that I'm talking about. Again, I'll defer to others if I'm mistaken here. Moving on to the 1st century CE, In the Facta et Dicta Memorabilia of Valerius Maximus, in chapter 9.2, he says, and here I am quoting, Ocus, who was afterwards called Darius, had bound himself by a most sacred oath to the Persians not to kill any one of those who had assisted him in the suppression of the 7 magi, either by poison or steel, or violence or lack of food. He therefore devised a more cruel method of death whereby he might remove those burdensome to himself without violating a religious constraint. So he filled a high-walled space with ashes and placed above them a protruding beam on which he put his victims after giving them food and drink, and from this they fell in their sleep onto the fatal heap, end quote. Now, there seems to be a lot of similarities with this from the narratives of Ctesias. But there's obviously some confusion going on. There's this conflation between Darius I, who in the Greek tradition is sort of at conflict by the wicked magi, and Darius II, who is called Ocus. Nevertheless, for Valerius Maximus, we can see that there is a Darius who executes his rivals in what I would say is a very passive manner. He doesn't murder them so much as place them into a very dangerous situation, which was almost certain to prove fatal. Now, I don't recommend you using that as a defense in court, should it ever come up, but for the king, maybe this is something that he can use to justify his actions. So we don't know really what sources the writer of Second Maccabees or Valerius Maximus used, so whether or not there's any direct connection between them and Ctesias, we don't know. I know I'm repeating that over and over again. But to the extent that Second Maccabees and Valerius Maximus appear to describe something very similar to this punishment of the ashes, possibly as a typical Achaemenid practice, it highlights some important features. It's a punishment that's reserved for very powerful enemies of the king. This is not for common criminals. It distances the king from the act of killing. And if you do take the time to read the handout at some point, you'll notice that Ctesias emphasizes several times that Darius is almost an unwilling participant. It's something he's forced into it by his co-conspirators or the royal women or something like that. So again, there's this distancing from the crime. And there's no indication that it's a public execution, and in Valerius Maximus's version, the fact that it's in an enclosed space sounds like it's going to be a hidden act, and whether or not it was secret in the sense that the fact of the killing was kept hidden, I don't know, but the actual the killing itself is not visible to the outside. And this, of course, is in obvious contradiction to what we have in the Byzantine inscription, where we are told in no uncertain terms that certain of the liar kings, after they have been captured, they are flayed or impaled, and then their bodies are left out so that everyone can see them. Part of the execution is its public performance. So with that in mind, we should start comparing this with other elite punishments. It's well known that in the Achaemenid Empire, rebellion is not just a military or political matter. It's a sinful rejection of Ahura Mazda's ordering of the cosmos, and of course the king's role in that ordered cosmos. And so such a grievous crime deserves an equally weighty punishment. Now, in his discussion of the so-called ordeal of the troughs, which Artaxerxes inflicts on an unfaithful courtier, Bruce Lincoln argues that the punishment was based on a particularly Zoroastrian worldview and was, quote, thoroughly grounded in religious principles that included such domains as ethics, cosmology, demonology, and salvation, end quote. And Professor Klinkott, who we'll be hearing from shortly, has also discussed punishment in his article on Xerxes' desecration of the corpse of the Spartan Leonidas after the Battle of Thermopylae. And he argues, I think very convincingly, that things like decapitation or impaling, they were certainly used by the Achaemenids, but they're not specifically Iranian. They enjoyed a long pedigree in the traditions of Near Eastern kingship, and as such, Xerxes' act after Thermopylae was not only a punishment for Leonidas and a threat to the other Greeks, although it certainly was that, by making use of an ancient Near Eastern expression of royal authority, so corpse mutilation, the king communicates to his subjects, especially other elites, that his legitimacy is as strong as ever. And so I think the punishment of the ashes fits into the same category as the ordeal of the troughs and the more general practice of corpse mutilation. It's a propagandistic performance and is to be read by other elites as a reassertion of royal power and a clear threat to any potential rebels of the king's essentially limitless ability to punish them. Now, where it stands out, as I've already hinted, is the absence of a public performance. But this, I believe, also finds an analog. In Xenophon's Anabasis, he describes how Cyrus the Younger puts an unfaithful subordinate called Orontus on trial. And it's possibly basically just a show trial, and there's an inevitable conviction. So the victim is led away and never to be seen again. And Xenophon specifies that no one even knows where this man is buried. Now, in this situation, Cyrus was attempting to overthrow the legitimate king, Artaxerxes II, and so Cyrus's own position is very precarious. Now, Kivni has argued that this public trial, followed by a secret execution, is aimed at ensuring to his other elite followers that Cyrus is not here to threaten their own status, and of course they should continue to support his bid for the throne. He's not out to eliminate the aristocracy in general, but only the bad apples, namely the king and his faithful followers. And likewise, according to Ctesias, Darius II and Artaxerxes II resort to the punishment of the ashes in a similar circumstances when they themselves are at great risk. The punishment is, I think, uniquely useful in such a case as it eliminates a dangerous enemy, but in secret, and as Second Maccabees emphasizes, it's so secret that it leaves no body behind to be buried, which might became a rallying point for enemies of the king. So in some ways, this is the practical function of this punishment, and does it have any specific ideological functions? Another interesting element of this punishment is the obvious role of fire to generate ashes. Now, there is some debate in the literature about this, whether or not these are hot ashes in which someone is burned, or these are cold ashes where someone suffocates. I don't know. It's just spοδὸν. There's no indication whether or not how long these ashes have been sitting there. We know that fire is, of course, sacred. To pollute it is a grave sin. And if we can't say exactly what religion the Achaemenids were, whether or not they were proto-Zoroastrians or Zoroastrians or whatever, fire is still clearly revered, very important in some way. And so I think we do have to come up with an answer for how the king can throw a person into ashes without causing pollution for himself. One potential answer from Valerius Maximus is that this emphasis on the separation of the king from the act itself. Darius does not want to murder his enemies because he will violate this oath, and this is a particularly religious problem for him. And so he places them in a situation where his hands stay clean and he can claim ignorance of what really is an inevitable outcome. Obviously it's problematic to bring in these much later texts, but in the Book 5 of the Vita of Dodd, there seems to be an indication that ignorance lessens the impact of pollution. So if you're burning wood that has collected some Nasu pollution, and you're unaware of this and you burn it, it's unclean, but it's not pollution in the sinful sense. There's also a distinguishing of grades of pollution. Again, in the Vita of Dodd, we are told that the corpse of the righteous Zoroastrian is far more polluting than that of the sinful man. And this is told in terms of, how many people nearby would this corpse infect? And so the corpse of a priest will infect, the next 10 people nearby, whereas the corpse of the lowest sinner is no more polluting than a frog that's been dead for a year. So I believe that Darius could argue that since his victims were rebels against the legitimate king himself, therefore they are very horrible sinners, and therefore to burn them isn't actually all that problematic. So, some conclusions. Once again, let me emphasize how speculative all of this is. There's all sorts of problems working with Ctesias, as I hope I've made clear. What I think we can take away from this is that Ctesias has described a punishment which seems to be more or less in line with what we know about punishment at the Achaemenid court amongst the imperial elites. Elite rebels or potential rebels have to be treated in a very special way. They have to meet their demise in a fashion that is befitting their crimes according to Zoroastrian ethics and cosmology. But mundane political realities can't be ignored. At transition periods, especially during and immediately after rebellions, the king's grip on power is particularly fragile, and he can't risk alienating other nobles while punishing one noble. Because, of course, every noble is a potential future rebel. Now, this in no way proves that Ctesias' narratives of the punishment of the ashes are accurate. I do believe, however, that they reflect an accurate understanding of the ideology of punishment at the Achaemenid court. Thank you.